Hi, my name is Jose Navarro. Today I will be analyzing Let It Be by the Beatles, written by Paul McCartney. And to start off, since this is a pop song, major selling point in a pop song, the catchy part of a pop song, at least, if you will, is the form. So why don't we dive right in and analyze the form? So as you can see, I sort of boxed in what is important here. At the beginning, in the piano solo, nothing else like it in the entire piece, so I labeled it as the intro, considering it is the intro, but I didn't want to label it as anything else like a major part. Like if we were to label later in the piece, verse 1, we label it as A, but I don't want to label the intro as A or anything like that because it's a small portion of the song and it never appears again. So I'm going to just call that the intro. Moving on to verse 1, I'm going to label that as A, as it is its own first portion of the song, if you will, that stands on its own. That's followed up by the chorus, which I labeled as part B. We'll see that pop up a lot later in the piece. That's followed by verse 2, A prime. The vocals change a little bit, so that's why I called it A prime. It's just like part A, but it's messed with a little bit, so I called that A prime. Moving on, that portion lasts till here in the piece where we see the chorus again labeled as part B. Nothing in the instrumentation range yet to note of. Moving on, we'll see in the chorus, I believe. Yes, in the chorus, we see an instrumentation change. This line right here in the music is written for, as Paul McCartney writes it, others. So we see a lot of instrumentation change. Here we see that it was organs for the most part, and that changes to brass. So that's something that you'll notice in the actual piece. Then moving into transition C, where the vocals disappear completely. Well, I labeled this as C because it doesn't mimic the chorus or anything like that. It sort of just stands on its own, but it's a big enough portion of the song to get its own labeling. We'll see that this chord progression that I talk about later in the video appears again, and we'll notice that that is done with the electrical piano, which is a huge portion of the song. It's a really famous chord progression in that song. You won't miss it. That appears again, but notice that it moves from an organ to an electrical piano because it has that unique sound. And then right after that chord progression, we go back to the organ again. After that little transition, we have a guitar solo, and I labeled that as part D because the guitar solo, it's its own portion, nothing else like it in the piece. Later we'll get to the chorus again, part B. We've seen that multiple times now. So then that gets labeled as part B again. And then we end up to a transition which mimics C. We'll see that instrumentation change again. We have a little bit in the brass a little bit earlier in the chorus. The brass comes in right around here, and then the brass exits to make way for the electrical piano for, again, that famous chord progression we all know to end the song. Alright, now that we've gone over the form of the piece, which is the main selling point, let's talk about the motifs specifically in the vocals. So, as I was analyzing this piece, I immediately noticed this little chunk of vocals here. This repeats a lot, so I labeled it as motif 1. Now moving on, in the piece we see that motif appear again, but in retrograde, which means that it's just the motif played backwards. And so then that's it for verse 1. So then moving on to the chorus, I labeled, I think, 2 motifs. So I have this motif right here, this series of 4 notes up here in the corner. If you guys can see that, it's an E, G, and an A played consecutively. So I also saw that repeat a lot in the chorus, so I labeled it as motif 2. And then right here, later in the piece, we have this EDC progression, another series of 5 notes, which I labeled as motif 3. Moving on to verse 2, motif 1 appears again here, sort of. It's messed with, there's a lot of ornamentation, but for the most part, motif 1 is still there. And then we have a little bit of motif 2 in a transposition, not exactly what we saw originally in motif 2, but a transposition nonetheless of the actual rhythm. So just notes in different places, but the rhythm is still there. Moving on to more verse 2, we see again the retrograde of the first motif here, and then in motif, then we see motif 3, which we originally saw in the chorus, but we see in verse 2 this time. It's that same EDC, nothing messed with this motif, just it appears again. And then motif 1 again appears, plus a little bit of ornamentation at the end. And then again motif 3 appears in verse 2, which we originally saw in the chorus earlier in the piece. Again, nothing messed with this time, just the actual motif, no ornamentation, no retrograde, no transposition or anything like that. Moving on to the chorus, that B part, the after A prime, we see motif 2 in a transposition. In EDC, the rhythm is still there. It's just transposed to a different key, if you will, a different area in the staff, if you will. Moving on, we don't see a motif pop up again until the end of the second verse. So we see motif 1 with a little bit of ornamentation there in the vocals, followed by motif 3. Again, motif 3 seems to be extremely consistent. Motif 3 has never been messed with so far in the piece, so that's something to pay attention to. Alright, moving on to the guitar solo. In the vocals sort of disappear here, so we won't see any motifs in the vocals themselves. Nothing in the guitar solo or anything in the other parts really repeats, so I can't really label anything as any motif because it doesn't appear more than once. So then once the chorus comes back in, again after the guitar solo, we see motif 2 pop up again almost immediately. And then towards the end of the piece, in the chorus, we have motif 2 again after a repeat sign. In the chorus, actually back up a bit, we see motif 1 messed with, a transposition. It's not in a retrograde, but it is transposed to a little bit higher range in the staff. And then again followed by motif 1. And then at the end of the chorus, right before that transition to the end, we see motif 1 like we did earlier up here, just a transposition of the original motif, but the exact same motif here. Alright, now that we've analyzed the form and the motifs of Let It Be, let's go over chord progressions and non-chord tones. So in the intro, we have a chord progression that is not seen at all again, so let's just go over that chord progression. We have a 1 chord. Keep in mind this is in C major. We have a 1 chord followed by 5, a 6, 1, 5, 5, 3, 2, 1, which makes a great chord progression to lead into something else. Keep your listener, if you will, your listener's attention. After that, in the chorus and in the verses, we see a chord progression that is repeated a lot. It'll be messed with from time to time, but it stays consistent. We have a 1, 5, 6, 1, 5, 4, 1. Now, sometimes Paul McCartney will throw in an extra 6, an extra 5, maybe an extra 1, or leave one of those chords out altogether. But if you look, I've labeled all of the chords with their Roman numerals, and for the most part, you see that they follow a very, very consistent pattern. He likes to go from a 1 to a 6, and then a 1 to a 5, and then from that 5 to a 4. And the non-chord tones actually repeat a lot. You'll see this appoggiatura specifically with that 1 and the 5 chord shows up a lot. Passing tones and neighbor tones in the lyrics happen a lot, consistent with those motifs as well. We'll see a passing tone here with another 4 and 1 chord. Again, that same appoggiatura that I talked about earlier up here repeats down here. just goes to show how repetitive this song is. A 1 and a 5 chord. Again, the same appoggiatura 2 measures later. Again, with that 1 and the 5 chord. So we'll see that pop up a lot. Same thing with the neighbor tones and passing tones in the lyrics. We have a neighbor tone here. That same appoggiatura I was talking about earlier. Again, the pattern of the chords stay the same. We'll see passing tones and neighbor tones pop up from time to time in the guitar whenever the guitar comes in. And then that same appoggiatura again. Paul McCartney loves this. That one, well, this time he uses a 6th chord, but usually with this specific appoggiatura, he'll use a 1 and a 5. So maybe a little something to change it up and keep your listener interested. So that time he changed it to a 1 to a 6. But other than that, the patterns for the most part in the piano and in the entire piece, as far as chords go, stay the same. A little appoggiatura in the lyrics is something that we haven't seen. That pops up right before the transition, and then a passing tone in the bass, and then again that same appoggiatura, 1 and a 5. Loves to do that, Paul McCartney. Again, later in the piece, right before transition C. And then we have this chord progression is specific to this part of the piece, and then the end part of the piece. We have a 5, 3, 1, 6, or 7, 6, 5, 4, 1. We see that pop up again at the end of the piece. The only 2 times this chord progression shows up. This is the end of the piece, and this is right before the guitar solo, so that'll pop up. But other than that, the non-chord tones and the chord progressions always stay the same, so nothing too much to go into detail with for the non-chord tones and the chords. So thanks for watching. That'll end my analysis video on Let It Be by the Beatles.